Hi everyone, today my group and I will be sharing our final presentation on the topic of psychedelic medicine, and more specifically, how psychedelics are revolutionizing modern psychiatric medicine for mood disorders. Now, before we begin, it's important to understand what we mean when we say psychedelics. Throughout history, there have been numerous naming conventions for these substances, and to highlight a few, the first in the West was psychotomimetic, which is a psychiatry word meaning mimicking psychosis. Another famously used name is hallucinogen, which is very common in earlier literature but somewhat misleading. And lastly, psychedelic, meaning mind manifesting, is the most common name today. By definition, psychedelics are a class of compounds that bind to serotonin 2A receptors in the brain. More simply and culturally, we know them as substances that induce intense changes in attention, information processing, and the perception of self, time, and meaning. They are non toxic and non addictive, and mostly known to be used in spiritual sacraments. Now that we've had the definition of psychedelics covered, another important aspect to these substances are their molecular structure. Psychedelics can be broken into two different broader groups, tryptamines and phenethylamines. What is interesting about the molecular structure of these two groups is they're extremely similar to androgynous chemicals, and androgynous chemicals are chemicals that our own bodies produce. Now, if we dive deeper into these two categories, tryptamine is a naturally occurring alkaloid common in plants and food. And if you take the tryptamine backbone and you add an oxygen and a hydrogen, you'll get serotonin. As we spoke about in class, serotonin is like the currency of our brain cells. It's a neurotransmitter involved in regulating mood, among other important functions. Then, if you add a phosphate group, you will get psilocybin. Additionally, in this category is DMT. What's important to note about how similar tryptamines are to serotonin is what that really might suggest about how it works within the brain, and broadly the similarities between these different psychedelics. Now, for the other category, if we start with the backbone of phenethylamine, and if you add just one spike, you get amphetamine or Adderall. And if you add another spike, you get methamphetamine or meth. And if you look at the other side of the molecule and you add a couple of hydrogen and oxygen groups, you get dopamine. Dopamine is particularly important, as we've learned in class, and is involved with motivation and reward. Now, history has played a really large and important role in psychedelic research in medicine. Because of cultural history, there has been what is considered three waves of psychedelic history. The three waves are the rise, suppression, and revival of modern psychedelics. Over the next 3 slides, I will take you from the BC era all the way into present 2021. So around 3700 BC, in the Shmula Caves in southwest Texas, crushed pieces of peyote were found. And peyote, for those of you who don't know what that is a small cactus whose principal active ingredient is the hallucinogen mescaline. And peyote has been used by Native people in northern Mexico and southwestern United States as part of traditional religious rites, which historically were used in psychedelics as part of ritual processes. The artifact was radiocarbon dated, but researchers do not exactly know how it was used at the time. Around 2000 BC in ancient Greece, there was a once a year special ceremony, secret ceremony, called the Eleusinian Mysteries. Any citizen could enter this ceremony with the only criteria being that the citizen did not murder another human being. The ceremony lasted throughout the night and was led by high priestesses that led the people through the rituals. The participants drank a substance called kekion, which many people think contain ergotamines, which LSD is derived from. They think that because it was grown in the same area. People who participated in these ceremonies also reported to have profound and transformational experiences and often called them very mystical. Around 1000 BC, Mayan mushroom stones were found in Guatemala and were thought to be used in the Mayan civilization. After around 1400 BC, the Aztec civilization were found to be using many different psychoactive plants and fungi associated with psychedelics. Now, the second wave of history is known as the rise and the fall of psychedelic research. In 1897, Arthur Hafter extracts the molecule mescaline from the peyote cactus 6,000 years after presumably other humans were using peyote in Texas. Fast forward to the 1940s and 1943, the famous chemist Albert Hofmann, who worked for the pharmaceutical company called Sandoz, was tasked to find a derivative of ergotamine so that it could be medically useful and the company could patent it. 5 years before that, Hoffman created lysergic acid dithylamine, or LSD, in his lab, but didn't think anything of it. He stored it on his shelf and actually went back to the molecule 5 years later. When he was looking at the molecule, he accidentally ingested some of it, potentially through his skin, and had the world's first accidental acid trip. He had a crazy experience, and the following Monday intentionally doses again. This instance influenced Sandoz to patent LSD a few years later, which was then sent to psychiatric hospitals all over. This spawned psychiatric research in every way possible using LSD, and that's the packaging right there. In the next 2 decades, there were about 1,000 clinical studies and 40,000 patients administered LSD and other psychedelics. At this point, researchers were really excited because this was a strong signal for the efficacy in the treatment of things like anxiety and depression, distress for patients at their end of their life, dealing with terminal illness, and alcoholism. During the same time period, this was the first time researchers were exploring antidepressants, so a very turbulent period of history for mental health discovery. In the early 1950s, a very important letter exchange occurs between two people, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who was one of the first psychiatrists to use LSD and other psychedelics in psychiatry, and Alex Huxley, who was an author who wrote Brave New World and Doors of Perception. Dr. Humphrey Osmond gave the author his first mescaline experience, and here's the letter exchange. The author says, "Dear Humphrey, to make this trivial world sublime, take a half a gram of phenytoin." The doctor then responds, "My dear Aldous, to fathom hell or grow angelic, take a pinch of psychedelic." And just 1 year later, here is the author, Alex Huxley, who writes Doors of Perception. Now, in 1955, an American banker named Gordon and his wife Valentina go down to Mexico and meet Maria Sabrina, who give them their first psilocybin experience. When the couple arrived back to the States, they wrote photojournalism essays that were then published in Life magazine. These were widely distributed, and the first time you hear the term magic mushrooms. Now, I want to point out that parallel cultural events were happening in our country. Just after the Life article was published, the usage of psychedelics escapes the lab and is used by a lot of different people. It becomes associated with the counterculture, anti-Vietnam protests, and anti-establishment movements. There was huge backlash and sensationalized media reports of this reckless usage, and the public opinion changed. The most famous figurehead from this movement was Timothy Leary, who motivated the movement with his famous quote, "Turn on, tune in, and drop out." This freaked out many people in the government specifically. In 1966, a decade after the positive article was published in Life, Life published another article that was titled "The Exploding Threat of the Mind Drug That Got Out of Control," referring to LSD. Richard Nixon then declares Timothy Leary the most dangerous man in the world, and in the same year, psychedelics are made illegal in California. In 1970, the Controlled Substance Act was signed, essentially saying that all psychedelics are Schedule I drugs, which is the most restrictive legal category, and the criteria meant that psychedelics had no acceptable medical usage. This was considered the dark ages because all active research that was happening was stopped for 20 to 30 years. Now we're 20 years later, and at this point of the third wave, we are considered at the beginning of this present renaissance. Research in this area has stopped until researcher Rick Strassman at the University of Mexico did the first study on psychedelics in 20 years and started MAPS, which is Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. This then spiraled into the resurgence of psychedelic research. A lot of money from private funding supporting research, and the broad spectrum of media coverage showed positive support towards psychedelics. And most recently, in 2018, there was an inflection point from the general public after the book How to Change Your Mind was published by Michael Pollan. And now, most recently, the creation of research centers for psychedelic medicine were established at Mass General, NYU, Berkeley, Stanford Medicine, Cedars-Sinai, just to name a few. The revival of research has led to some really incredible findings and promising new answers to old questions. These are two research papers as examples which rely heavily on the historical perspective and tribal usage of psychedelics and how to use these substances as a tool for internal spiritual journeys into one's mind. These findings, which will be discussed later on in the presentation, um, have really helped the field of mental health and psychiatry. So, why study psychedelics? Well, we can see how history has shaped our understanding and usage of psychedelics. And if we can understand how these agents have been used to heal suffering of various kinds culturally in the past, we can understand how to use them for the treatment of suffering in the present. So, more broadly, to understand the brain, to study the mind, and to reconceptualize the treatment of mental illness. Now I'm going to move over to my team member, Victoria, who will be discussing in more depth about modern research.
Thank you, Sophia, for giving such an astute and detailed description of what kind of timeline we're really working with across cultures, across institutions, across government when it comes to psychedelic experimentation. So as she mentioned, I will now be going into an expanded review of the methodologies and what best practices are looking like for modern day psychedelic experimentation. As she also mentioned, keep your eyes and ears peeled for the names Stanford, Johns Hopkins, and the like, because it is at these high power institutions where we are seeing the most cutting edge research taking place. So quickly, a Mars level analysis of what our rebirth of psychedelic medicine is looking like is the general computational and hypothetical understanding that in order to alleviate symptoms of otherwise treatment resistant anxiety and depression, there is a certain aspect within psychedelic substances such as mushrooms and psilocybin that is helping patients. And how are we algorithmically and methodologically going to explore that will be seen in the synthesis of verbal and medicinal therapy using psilocybin and or ketamine on a dosage dependent level that varies with patient body weight. This will all ultimately be implemented in our conclusion that psilocybin is helping to decrease connectivity and reactivity of the default modal network within medial prefrontal cortex in response to serotonin. Both myself and Sasha will go on to discuss this in greater depth as we proceed. So, a general overview in this expanded review. First, I would like you all to take away how scientists have slowly been able to reintroduce this topic into medical canon. It's taken quite a bit of force. I can definitely attest to that. How are we understanding what steps are needed to produce an unbiased analysis of these acute research studies into broader medical implications and understandings? And how are we identifying the remaining controversies and ethical concerns that still exist as we move forward with this research? And I hope we do. Some key terms are serotonergic antagonist, default modal network, which you heard just, just before, and the importance of setting in the psychedelic therapeutic field. Some facts and concepts to carry with you are that these meta-analyses are yielding significant effects in the reduction of MDD and GAD symptomatology in terminally ill patients up to 12 months post-treatment. And another caveat of that is that this new wave research was necessitated by using the terminally ill as sort of pilot participants when using such illicit and high stakes substances in research. So, how can one researcher really operationalize this into a study? The first thing, of course, is where is funding coming from? Most often when dealing with illicit substances such as psilocybin, a lot of funding will come from private institutions, private donors such as MAPS, which Sophia mentioned earlier. The government will often surprisingly pitch in only if the funds that they use and the substances and the participants are concentrated to the VA setting. A lot of this happens in PTSD research, and then more broadly, general IRB and grant processes that places such as Stanford and Johns Hopkins are trying to build upon and expand. Secondly, you're going to need a standardized patient intake criterion. What metrics are you using? There are many indices to assess your depression, anxiety, and the like. The meta-analysis I happen to look at used Beck's depression intake and the state trait anxiety inventory, which are just self-reportive measures, a list of 50, 60 plus questions asking about affect, daily living, etc. And the population group that was being targeted were those who are terminally ill, usually suffering from a certain form of cancer, and in a result of that are suffering from major depression and generalized anxiety towards the end of life. We need to standardize our methods. The typical dosing goes in 0.04 milligrams per kilogram of body weight in the patient, of course, susceptible to change based off of their first initial reactions. Some people are more reactive to a substance than another. And self-reportive measures combined with talk therapy in the group space to really yield if these are having long-term effects on mood and life outlook. And fourth and finally, we can see these mechanisms in action through neuroimaging. The mechanism that we are looking for is the 5-HT2A antagonism within the serotonergic system, which can be seen in PET scan, fMRI, ASL, and the like. I have pictures of those later on, which we can look at. Here we see exactly that. This might look familiar to the NMDA receptor machine that we talked about in the last week of class. So psilocybin is going in there and it is stopping these channels from moving back and forth. And this is actually quite good because post-mortem examinations on people with high suicidality and depression before their end of life show overactivity of these channels in the brain. So the inhibition of such is thought to prevent depressive and suicidal symptomology. The bottom graph that we see is PET scan and fMRI, centering in on the default mode network and internal systems, as well as broader prefrontal cortex. So you have a research study and it's saying, wow, people are actually feeling better about this. They're actually seeing relief from depression. How are we achieving a national consensus though within the medical field that this has validity in clinical space? And that is done through a meta-analysis approach, taking individual studies, sifting through hundreds and hundreds, as you can see on my slide, and finding where the consistencies lie. My specific meta-analysis looked at over 700 articles and used a randomized, control, trying to sift and screen through, and we're only able to find 4 publishings with 11 effect sizes that met their criterion of double blind. Both researcher and participant didn't know who was getting what, with a true control and placebo comparison. So those who are receiving a substance, which is psychoactive psilocybin, and those who are not, in the form of either blank placebo or minimal effective placebo, such as a high dose of a benzodiazepine. Using our Beck's depression intake and STAI, like I mentioned before, and lab synthesized psilocybin to standardize the product. There were 92 unique patients who were kind of exploring their trajectory in this process, and all of whom experience a similar model of set and setting with the group space. The results found over days and weeks of psilocybin admission found that cessation of SI and anxious symptomology were found. The graph to the right is just looking at biases within the study. These all passed the green light. There weren't any major biases or potholes in researchers' methods. Note the last name Griffiths, which I know my team member Erin at the very end will go on to discuss as a profound figure in this research. So overall, my meta-analysis, I apologize for the small print, my meta-analysis showed high statistical significance favoring the use of psilocybin in the reduction of major depressive and anxiety symptomology. That's all left yielding. And our remaining next steps. So there are still imperfections in this research. Having only 92 people, only 4 viable studies, we really need to explore this more. We need to understand, who is this helping? Not just the terminally ill, not just capitalizing on those who, if something goes wrong and they have a bad trip, we can just scapegoat it on the fact that they are passing away. So one of the big things we have to combat is the hype placebo effect. So, telling someone, hey, would you like to participate in a shroom study? I think a lot of us might go in expecting such high yielding results that we may inadvertently affect our true experience under the substance and under this therapy. Because we are dealing with illicit substances, unfortunately, there's higher clinical costs to conduct this research, which means less room for error if dosaging gets mixed up, if actually they would like to proceed with higher dosaging, but cost just didn't allow it. A lot of people worry about the addictive property, and though that has to do with the dopamine system, which we learned about in class, and psilocybin deals with serotonin, there is still something called tachyphylaxis, which is the rapid decrease in the effect of a drug with subsequent and consecutive dosaging, which can cause people to just, over and over and over use a substance, which definitely in the case of something psychoactive like shrooms and psilocybin can have long-term effects. So because of that, authors are suggesting that even if psilocybin-based medicine comes to market, it should be highly regulated and prescribed responsibly. And then finally, a huge concern is hallucinogen persisting perception disorder or prolonged psychosis, drug-induced psychosis after substances, though none of these cases ever yielded HPPD in the study. It is something that we have to monitor. It's something that can be very negatively life-affecting if a person unfortunately has this in study. However, proper screening for genetic factors such as schizophrenia or a pre-existing mood disorder can help if caught early on, and that participant is unfortunately negated from the study. But I end with our need for more funding, more research, normalizing that this medical approach has valid tools and is, just has sat for 30 plus years without much gain. And we really need to use that to help those in need because the data shows that it does. I would like to thank all of the references I've used, but most importantly, the incredible Psych 215B team. They inspired, that was a elective I took this past quarter. They inspired my verve and candor in this speech, and I definitely recommend it to anyone who liked what they heard today. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Sasha, and I'll be discussing the first legal psychedelic medicine, but somewhat controversial drug, ketamine. Psychedelics are generally non-toxic and non-habit forming, as Sophia mentioned. However, ketamine is a Schedule III drug, and for good reason. It has a high liability for abuse and detrimental effects on cognition from chronic use. That being said, ketamine is quite safe in the short term, so abuse potential doesn't necessarily preclude its integration into treatment. Researchers, mainly those at top universities, as Victoria pointed out, have been working to highlight ketamine's wide-ranging therapeutic potential. Ketamine is commonly associated with the label of horse tranquilizer and has proven a highly effective anesthetic for humans and animals with a remarkably high safety profile since its approval by the FDA in the early 70s. Essentially, it doesn't affect people's vital signs as much as other sedation methods. Vietnam War veterans first benefited from the drug, both as an anesthetic, but also using it recreationally and giving it the name Special K, like the cereal. Ketamine is also known as K, Kitty, horse treats, or cat Valium. However, ketamine was originally synthesized not purely as a veterinary drug or anesthetic, but to advance the PCP model in investigating schizophrenia as researchers pursued the development of antipsychotic drugs. Phencyclidine was deemed unsafe for use on humans, so ketamine, another NMDA antagonist, which binds at the PCP receptor site, was synthesized. Testing ketamine on human subjects serendipitously found benefits for mood, and research into its possibility for antidepressant use commenced in the early 2000s. So these are the MARS levels of analysis for studying ketamine. I'll mainly focus on the controversies at the implementational level, namely in determining causal evidence for the mechanism by which ketamine produces its antidepressant effects. This remains the main gap in our pharmacological knowledge of ketamine. So here's the algorithm by which ketamine alleviates suicidal ideation. Generally, the conclusion is that ketamine has rapid antidepressant effects, which persist for about a week. And this makes ketamine treatment invaluable to patients at immediate risk to themselves or others. Traditional treatments are slower to act. ECT takes about a week, SSRIs take a month. Ketamine appears to have acute pro-cognitive effects, which lessen impulsivity and hopelessness. 0.5 milligrams per kilogram intravenously is the standard dose for treatment, and the use of lower doses in an attempt to lessen the dissociative effects appeared largely ineffective. The question is then, by what neurobiological mechanism does ketamine produce its antidepressant effect? If we knew this, we could maybe create a new, better antidepressant drug. So this is the glutamate hypothesis. As an NMDA receptor antagonist, ketamine's main mechanism of antidepressant action was first thought to be glutaminergic. However, this doesn't appear to be the case. Attempts to mimic and prolong the antidepressant effects of ketamine with a similar glutaminergic agent, namely a drug called riluzole, failed. Ketamine has also been shown to disrupt the default mode network in fMRI scans. DMN is a buzzword in the field of psychedelics, and disruption is associated with decreased rumination. So this is another prevalent hypothesis, but not as useful in the synthesis of new drugs. The neurogenesis hypothesis, ketamine's pro-cognitive effects may be the result of the stimulation of mTOR. Stimulating mTOR promoted neurogenesis in preclinical rodent trials. And to test this hypothesis, Abdallah et al. Gave human participants rapamycin, an mTOR inhibitor, but rather than block the antidepressant effects of ketamine, rapamycin appeared to potentiate the effect and shows preliminary evidence for a possible mode of extending antidepressant action, but not as a hypothesis for the mechanism of antidepressant action, unfortunately. So the mu-opioid receptor. While trying to determine the most promising theory for an antidepressant mechanism of action to present, I ran across an article produced by Stanford Medicine. It proclaimed that Boris Heifetz and his team has discovered the mechanism behind ketamine's antidepressant effects. So is the debate over? Also, Boris is currently an assistant professor of anesthesiology, and by courtesy of psychiatry and behavioral sciences, he was an important figure in Psych 215B, psychedelic medicine this quarter. And here's a screenshot of Boris mid-sentence in class. So this is one of the many rabbit holes I went down trying to understand ketamine. Basically, Boris's team conducted a remove experiment in human patients to confirm the findings of their preclinical rodent study, that the mu-opioid receptor is involved in ketamine's mechanism of action. Subjects were given naltrexone, an opioid receptor antagonist typically administered to help people battle addiction. The antidepressant effects of ketamine were markedly attenuated for the group that received naltrexone, and the study was cut short due to the clear results. Remove experiments are the basis for determining causal evidence, so this seemed to be a clear answer. Ketamine may act directly on opioid receptors, but it may also act indirectly through crosstalk with the NMDA receptor or stimulating endogenous production of opioids. Ketamine is not considered an opioid, but preclinical evidence showed that ketamine can bind to mu-opioid receptors, so that's pretty straightforward support for the direct action interpretation. To summarize this dialogue with Dr. Sanakara at Yale, it's just hard to tell whether ketamine's antidepressant effect comes from some interaction with opioid receptors, or if naltrexone makes people feel so terrible that ketamine's beneficial effects are obscured. I think this discussion highlights the difficulties in psychopharmacological studies when translating preclinical evidence from one mechanism of action into studies on human patients. So, are the dissociative / mystical effects relevant to antidepressant effects? This is a big question in psychedelics. Main consensus for ketamine is that we don't know, but probably not. Like with any psychedelic, it's important to have a framework which allows for the integration of insights from salient experiences to provide lasting therapeutic benefit to the patient. And those are some interesting quotes to read. Another controversy is which form of ketamine would be most beneficial to patients. Generic ketamine is a racemic mixture containing a right and left-handed molecule that are mirror images of each other. The generic form of ketamine is a cheap and accessible drug to virtually any physician. For this reason, it doesn't lend itself well to commodification by big pharma. This topic makes me personally very sad, as the most effective alleviation of suffering is often overlooked due to profit-motivated funding. But that's a topic for another presentation. I reference a link to a talk by Elias Docker, an eloquent psychiatric researcher at Yale who makes clear his opinion on this absurdity and studies ketamine for addiction within a mindfulness framework. So when Johnson & Johnson failed at gaining patent rights to the regular old ketamine molecule, they split it in two, extracting one half, or the S isomer, thus synthesizing S-ketamine, aka Spravato. Spravato they scraped by in receiving FDA approval, so ketamine goes down in history as the first legally prescribable psychedelic medicine. The benefits of any type of ketamine were concluded to be largely the same in clinical trials. However, the S isomer appears to have more psychedelic effects, whereas the R isomer may show more robust antidepressant effects. Therefore, the S isomer could be effective in psychedelic therapeutic models, which emphasizes the integration of mystical experience, and the R isomer could offer more pharmacological insight into the mechanism of antidepressant action, or in a psycholytic framework, which emphasizes maximizing the benefits of talk therapy with non-mystical but still cognitively beneficial effects of psychedelics. So ketamine provides an insightful and promising tool for studying possible future antidepressants. I spoke with Pierre Yorick, who works in Boris's lab. He concluded that ketamine is a very dirty drug. It targets so many receptors that it becomes hard to figure out which mechanism of action is responsible for any one of its effects. We have some correlational understanding of how ketamine works based on rodent and human studies from the past 20 years, but we have yet to establish causal evidence for ketamine's mechanism of antidepressant action. Rigorous translational models are necessary to bridge knowledge gained from rodent studies to studies with humans. Boris's research on the mu-opioid receptor and Abdallah's research on the effects of mTOR signaling inhibition are both pretty good examples of this. Ultimately, the synthesis of a drug which can replicate the antidepressant effects of ketamine will provide definitive causal evidence, an endeavor which has thus failed on a billion-dollar scale, but is quite exciting in the field of psychopharmacology. While discussing ketamine and focusing on it as a useful tool for studying the mechanism of antidepressant action, I have largely neglected many topics, including the ketamine societal impacts. Ketamine clinics are popping up at an alarming rate, so hopefully they do more good than harm for people. The risk for abuse means that we have to be careful and make sure clinics aren't just doing this for a quick buck and are truly supporting patients. There will likely be the formation of a natural registry for outpatient ketamine administration, just to monitor for potential signs of abuse. So I'd love to talk more about ketamine with anyone who's interested in a more relaxed fashion, so I'm leaving my number. Thank you very much.
The exciting advancements within the psychedelic medicine space, such as those mentioned by my teammates, have been made possible by the work of prominent scientists. One such prominent scientist is Dr. Roland Griffiths. Dr. Roland Griffiths is regarded as the grandfather of the psychedelic medicine movement. Over 40 years after the Nixon administration had effectively shut down research on psychedelic drugs, Dr. Roland Griffiths helped restart this research. He has been prolific in producing peer-reviewed research articles and helping to establish and build the scientific foundation needed for this field to advance. As one of the nation's leading psychopharmacologists, Dr. Roland Griffiths' research has focused on the behavioral and subjective effects of mood-altering drugs. He is a professor in psychiatry and neuroscience at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, and it's there that he is the lead investigator of the psilocybin research initiative. So Dr. Griffiths has spearheaded studies at the psilocybin research initiative on everything from brain imaging studies to examine neural mechanisms of action, to psilocybin facilitated smoking cessation, to psilocybin usage for terminal cancer patients and treating their depression and anxiety. Further, he has been a consultant to the National Institute of Health and to numerous pharmaceutical companies in the development of new psychotropic drugs. So as I was researching this section, I came across a quote by Dr. Roland Griffiths that particularly stood out to me. So he says, what is different about psilocybin compared to other mood-altering drugs or pharmaceuticals is the enduring meaning and belief changes that can occur. People feel reorganized in a way they don't with other drugs. And so I think a lot of Dr. Roland Griffith's excitement about the potential of psychedelic medicine really stems from how it compares to other existing pharmaceuticals. And we get a small taste of this through this quote. And so I think that that was one perspective that I think comes across in all of his different research and all of his different initiatives, his public speaking and different education initiatives that he's a part of. And I think this quote is really important to understand for understanding his excitement about the field. So now I want to really dive deep into some of Dr. Roland Griffith's specific research. So some of his most notable studies include those that are aimed at understanding the neural mechanisms of psilocybin. So in 2016, Dr. Griffiths was awarded the first ever NIH grant to study the effects of psilocybin on brain function. And this was a really groundbreaking moment. Again, he was the first person that the NIH had ever given a grant to study psilocybin. And so in one of his initial studies, Dr. Griffiths and his collaborators, they assessed the effects of psilocybin on the human claustrum. So the claustrum is a thin sheet of gray matter that reaches out to every other region in the brain, and it was once thought to be kind of like the seat of consciousness. However, the claustrum has historically been really difficult to study, and its function remains largely unknown. So in this particular study, Dr. Griffiths used fMRI brain imaging, such as that we learned about in class, to observe the activity and connectivity of the claustrum in 15 people after taking psilocybin or placebo. So results found that both the default mode network and areas of the brain believed to be responsible for setting attention and switching tasks were disrupted during the effects of psilocybin. And actually alterations occurred in the claustrum that may account for these changes. So as you can see on the figure that's currently on this slide, so this figure shows a subset of the results and shows the effects on the connectivity between the claustrum and other areas of the brain that the study found. So the left figure shown here shows the changes between the left claustrum and connectivity to other areas of the brain, and then the right claustrum shows the changes between with other areas of the brain in regards to connectivity as an effect of the psilocybin treatment. And so this study showed that psilocybin alters claustrum connectivity with brain networks that support perception and cognition. And the study helps us become one step closer to understanding the neural mechanisms of psilocybin. And again, this was a really groundbreaking study because up until this time, there had been no NIH grant-funded research that had really been diving into the neural mechanisms of psilocybin. And to this day, a lot of the exact neural mechanisms remains largely unknown. So another notable study by Dr. Griffiths, and really one that sparked the field and sparked the development of the modern psychedelic movement, as Sophia mentioned at the beginning, was Dr. Griffith's study that examined the effects of psilocybin treatment in cancer patients. So cancer patients often develop chronic and clinically significant symptoms of depression and anxiety. And so the effects of psilocybin were studied in 51 cancer patients who all had a life-threatening diagnosis, and they all were presenting symptoms of depression and or anxiety. So the figure here, as you can see in the figure shown on the screen, it shows an example of what the psilocybin sessions look like. So this randomized double-blind crossover trial investigated the effects of a very low or placebo-like dose of psilocybin versus a high dose of psilocybin. And these doses were administered with 5 weeks between sessions, and each subject had a 6-month follow-up. So as part of the study, participants, staff, and community observers rated participants' moods, attitudes, and behaviors throughout the study. So there was different time points at the study in which all of these different people would rate the participants on a variety of different scores. And so it was found that the high dose psilocybin compared to the placebo amount psilocybin produced large decreases in measures of depressed mood and anxiety, along with increases in quality of life, life meaning and optimism, and decreases in death anxiety. And further, it's important to note and really interesting to note that at the 6-month follow-up time point, these changes were sustained within about 80% of participants who were continued to show clinically significant decreases in depressed mood and anxiety. So this landmark study became the basis for the initiation of registration of trials in the US and Europe seeking approval of psilocybin for medical treatment. So despite the large promising scientific advancements, there's large unanswered research and ethical questions. From a scientific perspective, as the studies by Dr. Griffiths illustrates, the exact neural mechanisms of psychedelics remains largely unknown. Further, it's unknown whether the hallucinogenic properties are needed for clinical efficacy, what the frequency and amount of doses should be, and there's also unanswered questions about the overall general safety of psychedelics, especially from a longitudinal perspective. And we also need more understanding of why some people have bad trips. So the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS for shorts, has been especially focused on developing ethical frameworks for the development of psychedelic medicine. So ethicists at MAPS have noted some of the unique challenges associated with psychedelic medicine, and they have developed an ethical framework shown here that encompasses some of the main challenges and gives them associated principles for ethical development. And so the ethicists and the people at MAPS are really developing these new types of scorecards to measure how well they as an organization and also other organizations within the space are living up to their ethical commitments. The clear commitment to ethics across all operations will be imperative for the development of new treatments for some of the most intractable mental health conditions. And so this is a really important area and branch of psychedelic medicine development. Here are my references. Thank you so much.